boy from the farm. At some point in that cold and damp 1819 Scotland, while the wind stubbornly bent the trees of Ayrshire and the mud clung obstinately to boots, the life of a boy barely 14 years old split in two without him fully realizing it. John Walker, the son of farmers, raised among cows, rain and routine, watched his father die and, with him, the fragile sense of stability provided by that family farm on the outskirts of Kilmarnock, a farm that was not simply a piece of land, but the center of gravity of his world, the place where every dawn had always followed the same script: milking, loading, repairing, obeying, surviving. Adults talk about inheritances as if they were figures on a piece of paper. But at the kitchen table, while his mother and relatives discuss what to do, for John, it is not just 400 and some pounds that are at stake, but the decision to break with everything familiar, because selling the farm means abandoning the identity of an entire family. And yet, it is in that context of grief and uncertainty that a decision is made which at first glance seems pragmatic, almost defensive: to liquidate the property, turn the land into money, and buy a small grocery shop in Kilmarnock. A turn that transforms that simply dressed adolescent into a merchant's apprentice in a city that is beginning to move to the rhythm of the new industrial era. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from where in the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I would love to read you in the comments, because in the end, these stories of entrepreneurship also speak about how each person faces their own plot twists. Kilmarnock is not London or Glasgow, it is a modest town. But for a farm boy accustomed to always seeing the same hills, the simple act of walking through streets with shop windows, chimney smoke, and overlapping conversations already feels like a kind of electric shock. The shop the family buys is small, a place with worn wooden shelves, stacked sacks, the smell of grain, of tea, of damp spices, a space where each product has its price, but also its story, and where suddenly the survival of the Walkers depends on something new: understanding what others want, what they buy, what they repeat, what they reject, what they recommend. John is shy, reserved, and also has a curious peculiarity for a future king of whiskey. He practically does not drink, because in early 19th century Scotland, the alcohol that circulates among the popular classes is often harsh, irregular, uncontrollable, a liquid that burns too much, that brings problems with the law, and that coexists with a growing current of religious moralism that looks with suspicion on excess. For him, that distance from strong drink, far from being an obstacle, ends up being an advantage, since it allows him to relate to the product with a mixture of respect and analytical coldness, observing it as one more ingredient in the storeroom, something that must be managed, understood, and improved. While the city vibrates with the changes brought by the industrial era, with new tax laws and with a whiskey production that begins to leave clandestinity and enter the legal circuit, the Walker shop becomes a small laboratory of everyday capitalism. Every customer who crosses the door offers John a piece of information. Every complaint, every compliment, every gesture of disappointment when a sack comes worse than the previous one, teaches him to read a silent language, that of expectations, the terrain where the success of any venture is played out, because people can forgive many things in a local business. But there is one thing they punish quickly, and that is a lack of consistency. In the back room, while he weighs flour or wraps tea, John listens to stories, picks up rumors, hears people comment that the whiskey from a certain cask is smoother today, that another arrives too aggressive, that small distillers do what they can, and the result varies in a desperate way. The legislation has changed. There are more distilleries, more supply, but also a true lottery in every cask. so that one day a customer leaves delighted, and the following week returns with the same purchase and a grimace of displeasure, because the liquid in the glass bears little resemblance to the one kept in memory. For a farm boy turned shopkeeper, that problem could be just an inventory detail, a matter resolved by changing supplier, lowering the price, or assuming that things are simply that way. But in John's mind, another way of seeing it begins to form. The young man who grew up watching his father obsess over the cows, over the quality of the pastures, over the yield of the land in each season, starts to apply the same mindset to the casks that come in through the back door of the business. He smells them, compares them, tastes small amounts, observes the faces of customers when they buy them by the dram, detects nuances, realizes that although each cask is different, there are repeated profiles, common notes, strengths, and defects that he could manage. The death of the father and the leap from the farm to commerce, far from being a simple change of scenery, act as forced training in something that will later be crucial. Learning to live with risk. The farm had its own dangers, a bad harvest, a disease in the livestock, an untimely storm. But the shop is something else. Here the risk is more abstract, measured in boxes, in debts, in customer loyalty, in a reputation spread by word of mouth. And John, though still young, begins to experience that daily tension felt by entrepreneurs when they open the shutters each morning without knowing exactly how they will close the cash box at the end of the day. The environment, moreover, is not forgiving. Scotland is going through a process of profound change, with population movements, with new factories, with a food and beverage market that is becoming professionalized the hard way, so that the boy who weighs sacks and arranges merchandise is not growing up in a bubble, but in the middle of an economic transition where efficiency, accounting, and the ability to differentiate oneself begin to mark the difference between businesses that last decades and those that disappear without a trace. In that atmosphere, every small decision of the Walker family, from which supplier to choose to how to extend credit to a regular customer, becomes a practical lesson in management. Behind the counter, John sharpens another silent but decisive skill: attention to detail, that meticulous focus on things others overlook, such as the way the same person talks about last week's tea, today's coffee, or last night's whiskey, as if measuring the coherence of the service received. And without yet fully realizing it, the young man begins to sense that the great opportunity lies not only in selling more than other shops, but in offering something others cannot guarantee, a kind of emotional promise disguised within the product. The peace of mind of knowing that what you take home tastes the way you expect it to taste, again and again. The story of John Walker in these early years is that of someone who has not yet found his great idea in modern terms, but who is building, step by step, the mental foundations that will make it possible. Because by combining the discipline of the countryside with commercial sensitivity, by mixing the experience of loss with the responsibility of supporting his family, he develops a way of thinking in which quality ceases to be an abstract concept and becomes an obsession, a kind of internal compass that will very soon manifest itself in the way he decides to treat every cask of whiskey that enters the shop. In the end, that boy from the farm who arrived in Kilmarnock, dragging the weight of grief and the fear of an uncertain future, transforms into the young shopkeeper who, without making noise, begins to look at whiskey with the eyes of a craftsman and a strategist, willing to intervene, to combine, to correct what the luck of distillation leaves unfinished. And it is precisely in that territory, in the day-to-day life of the shop, where his story will cease to be that of a simple merchant and become that of someone who dares to modify what he receives, taking the first step toward that blend that will end up being his personal hallmark and that we will discover as we delve into the daily life of his small business. The shop that sold fog. Every morning, when Kilmarnock awakens among smoking chimneys and carriages dragging themselves along still damp streets, the small Walker shop opens its doors with an almost mechanical ritual. The creak of wood, the clink of a poorly placed bottle, the sweep of brooms lifting the dust of the previous day. And in the middle of all that discreet noise, the figure of John adjusting sacks, aligning tins, arranging glass jars on shelves that still retain the smell of recent carpentry because the business is young and its future is far from guaranteed, breathing at the irregular rhythm of a city in transformation. In those early years, the shop functions as a kind of microcosm of the Scottish market of the time, a place where stable products coexist, such as tea or flour, with others that behave like capricious creatures, among them the whiskey that arrives in barrels of diverse origins, some marked with the names of legal distilleries trying to secure a place under the new legislation, others bearing ambiguous signs, heirs to the time when clandestine distillation dominated the valleys. And each of those barrels represents a possibility, but also a risk, because one never knows exactly what will come out when the spigot is opened. From the back room, John observes that reality with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Because the Excise Act of 1823 has changed the game board. The law makes legal whiskey production easier, reduces taxes, regulates distilleries, and seeks to impose order where chaos once reigned. However, the market will take time to stabilize. There are distillers who adapt, others who improvise, some who launch themselves into producing more volume than they are capable of controlling. And the result is an avalanche of barrels that can be a resounding success for the shop or turn into an endless source of customer complaints. When a new barrel arrives at the storeroom, the workers unload it with care, place it in a corner that already looks like a small forest of dark wood and rusted iron. And as soon as they can, John approaches, examines it closely, looks at the markings, feels the surface, crouches down, runs his hand along the joints, smells the nearby air, as if searching for an invisible clue that might anticipate what he will find inside. Upon opening it, the first rush of aroma becomes an immediate judgment. There are days when the fragrance promises something warm and deep, and others when what emerges smells like an unbridled spirit, aggressive alcohol that does not invite the glass, but almost threatens it. The most frustrating thing for a shopkeeper like him is not that there are bad barrels. That is part of the business and can be managed. The real problem appears when two barrels from the same origin, with the same seal, with the same promise written on the wood or in the paperwork, offer very different experiences. A batch that sold very well the previous week can have, in its next delivery, a completely different profile. And then, the customer who returns seeking to repeat a specific pleasure finds something he does not recognize, a kind of shadow of the flavor he enjoyed. And that feeling of deception, even without bad intention, weighs more than any discount. At the counter, the scene repeats itself again and again. A man enters after a day at the factory or in the fields, asks for a measure or a bottle, recalls with a smile the whiskey from the previous week, evokes it with few but forceful words. And when he brings the new purchase to his mouth, his expression shifts slightly. Perhaps he raises an eyebrow, maybe he presses his lips together a second longer than usual. Some let it pass and leave resigned. But there are also those who return the next day and drop an uncomfortable comment. This time, it was not the same. A phrase that for a sensitive merchant functions like a storm warning. John listens very carefully to that kind of phrase. Repeats it to himself mentally, almost as if filing it away in an invisible drawer. He returns to it at night when the shop closes and silence finally takes over the place. In those moments of calm, He lets his gaze wander over the barrels, the shelves, the jars with handwritten labels. And he realizes that the products that give him the least headaches are those whose quality varies little. While whiskey, that liquid with the potential to be a huge source of income, behaves like a dense fog, unstable, dispersing, or concentrating according to factors many attribute to luck, but which he is determined to understand. The shop begins to earn a reputation in Kilmarnock. People recognize it, recommend it for buying tea, coffee, flour, some condiments. And amid that growing credibility, whiskey becomes an evident weak point, something that can strengthen the prestige of the business or strip it away without asking permission. John, who has inherited from the countryside an almost stubborn patience, refuses to accept volatility as an inevitable destiny. And for that reason, he inaugurates a small ritual that will change the meaning of his work. Instead of serving the contents of each barrel as it arrives, he begins to combine small quantities, to blend, to correct the character of the liquids, trying to make the final experience more homogeneous for the customer. This step, which may seem modest, actually represents a very deep change in business mentality, because the young shopkeeper stops seeing whiskey as a closed commodity and begins to treat it as a raw material that allows human intervention, almost like a canvas that a painter can modify with different brush strokes. He takes part of the contents of a softer barrel and harmonizes it with another more powerful one, tests proportions, makes small notes, records reactions, and with each trial, even when he makes mistakes, he moves closer to an objective he has not yet put into words, but which lives in his intuition. That the customer who returns to his shop receives something that increasingly resembles a stable commitment. As this practice becomes established, the day-to-day of the business fills with small details that refine the idea. John observes who comes back to buy, who reduces their consumption, who recommends the shop to friends or family. And he learns to read a rudimentary but effective metric based on short conversations, on glances, on silences that say a great deal. Without charts, without Excel spreadsheets, without consultants, he is carrying out a real-time analysis of consumer behavior, guided by a mixture of logic and sensitivity that turns every interaction into a clue for adjusting his blend. At the same time, the legal and economic environment continues to evolve. Large distilleries grow stronger, some brands begin to carry more weight, and competition among shops intensifies. Each merchant seeks his own strategy. There are those who compete on price, those who bet on volume, those who rely on a very localized clientele. But in John's mind, a different idea begins to take shape. If he manages to make his whiskey have a recognizable personality, if each purchase in his shop produces a sense of continuity on people's palates, then the Walker's surname will cease to be merely a sign on the facade and will become, little by little, a kind of invisible seal in the consumer's memory. That transformation does not happen in a day or in a month. It cooks slowly among barrels, among almost domestic notes and conversations that at first glance might seem trivial. As he grows more secure in his role as a blender, although he still does not use that term with any grandeur, his relationship with whiskey stops being timid. He begins to trust his judgment, to identify patterns, to quickly distinguish different origins just by smell or the first sip. And that confidence, discreetly, translates into increasingly firm decisions when choosing which barrels to buy, which to discard, and how to use them. The shop that at the beginning sold fog, in the sense that it offered a product whose quality moved like an unpredictable bank of mist, begins to clear the horizon. And beneath the surface of a still modest day-to-day, a change is taking shape that will transcend the small grocery trade of Kilmarnock. Because every blend John prepares, every customer who repeats a purchase with a smile of recognition, is pushing, almost without knowing it, the evolution of a grocer into an artisan of consistent flavor, a figure that will become the core of everything that comes afterward. When blending in the back room is no longer enough, and the family surname begins to seek its place on labels. The artisan of constant flavor. With the passing of the years, the experiments in the back room stop being simple, improvised trials and turn into an almost disciplinary routine. Because John no longer limits himself to opening barrels and mixing by eye. Now every movement has a purpose. Every measure that passes from one container to another is guided by an idea that has been born from many conversations, from many hours of observing and listening. The shop awakens with the same appearance as always. Stacked sacks, shelves filled to the brim, slanted light entering through the window. But among those everyday objects, something invisible begins to exist that is worth more than any merchandise. The judgment of a man who has decided that his whiskey will not depend on luck. In a corner, on a sturdy wooden table, small worn notebooks pile up where John writes down details that other shopkeepers would find exaggerated. He notes the origin of each barrel, the smell when opening it, the sensation of the first sip, the body on the palate, the way the warmth spreads through the chest, and even the spontaneous comment of some regular customer who agrees to try a new blend before it goes public because he has created with them a relationship that goes beyond a simple transaction. He asks them what they have noticed, whether they feel it rougher, rounder, sweeter. And while they search for words, he sharpens his own internal language to translate sensations into blending decisions. In those seemingly simple exchanges, there is a brutal lesson in entrepreneurship. Because John understands that the customer's palate is the final judge. But he also perceives that most people do not have technical vocabulary. So he learns to listen beyond words. He pays attention to the gesture, to the pause before answering, to the way someone clears their throat after a sip. And from that gestural reading, he draws conclusions that he later turns into concrete adjustments. One measure less of a certain barrel that is too aggressive, a greater presence of another that brings smoothness, a different combination for a batch intended for a customer who prefers more intensity. Little by little, the concept of constant flavor becomes a personal obsession. Although John never formulates it in a grandiloquent way. Because what moves him is not rhetoric, but the memory of all those times when he saw someone become disappointed upon discovering that what they had enjoyed days before was no longer there. And for that reason, he sets out to achieve what for his time is almost a utopia. That any person who asks for his whiskey, today or within a few months, can recognize it like an old acquaintance, with nuances, with small natural variations, but always within the same personality. Just as one recognizes a friend by the way he walks, even from afar, the path toward that goal is not free of stumbles. In fact, on more than one occasion, a blend that seemed promising to him ends up being a failure at the counter. There are days when a customer returns the bottle with contained politeness. Others when someone drops a harsher criticism than usual. And instead of justifying the mistake, John takes those situations as an uncomfortable mirror that forces him to review the process. He goes back to the notebooks, compares notes, tries to understand which decision led to that result. And the important thing is that he assumes responsibility, offers changes, compensates the affected person, demonstrating something many businesses forget. Trust is also built when things go wrong, as long as there is transparency and a willingness to correct. The consequence of this silent work becomes visible in the way customers begin to refer to the product. They no longer ask for just any whiskey. Some approach the counter and, without giving it much thought, say that they want the House One. Others directly mention the surname, "Pour me the Walker whiskey," as if they were naming something that already has an identity of its own. It is a small linguistic change, but it reflects something enormous. The product has ceased to be generic in people's minds. It has stopped being just another liquid among so many, and has become an experience associated with a name, a face, a specific shop, that moment. Which surely goes unnoticed in the accelerated rhythm of the day, is key to understanding how real brands are born. Because before a designed label exists, before a logo or a corporate color is agreed upon, the first thing that happens is that mental appropriation, that instant in which consumers agree, without talking to each other, to call something by a certain name. And in the case of John Walker, that agreement has a very simple basis. They know that when they ask for his whiskey, they receive something that resembles the memory they have of the previous time. From the perspective of a contemporary entrepreneur, this process would be the equivalent of building a value proposition around consistency. And John, who would never have used those words, understands it in practice. He realizes that his advantage is not in offering the strongest drink or the cheapest, but in occupying a place of trust in people's daily lives. That place that makes someone, after a hard day, choose his whiskey because they know what to expect. Without unpleasant surprises, without shocks to the palate. That kind of relationship is not created with big advertisements. It is born from a sum of small successes repeated over time. To achieve that repetition, the shopkeeper is forced to work like a clockmaker in his own business. He begins to systematize what were once intuitions. He sets clearer proportions, defines which distilleries he finds more reliable, dares to reject barrels that do not meet his standard, even if that means losing immediate margin, and even instructs those who help him in the shop to respect certain guidelines, because he has understood that the process cannot depend solely on his physical presence. He needs the blend to become a method, something that can be replicated when he is not standing there. At this stage, the back room functions like a small artisanal laboratory, where each jug, each measuring glass, each barrel with a chalk mark plays a precise role. And at the same time, the counter turns into a space of constant verification, a place where decisions are tested almost in real time, without focus groups or market studies, simply by observing who comes back, who recommends the shop to another person, who starts buying a larger quantity because they feel comfortable with the experience. Thus, the distance between production and customer is minimal, which allows for an agility that many large businesses would envy. As Walker's whiskey consolidates its personality, something also changes in John's own mind. He stops seeing himself as someone who simply sells what arrives and begins to perceive himself as the person responsible for a product with a soul, a creation that carries his judgment embedded in it, something that, in a certain way, represents him. This awareness brings with it more ambitious decisions. He reinvests profits in securing better batches, negotiates with suppliers from a different position, because he no longer asks for barrels at any price. Now he demands certain qualities, and if that implies paying more, he accepts the cost, trusting that the loyalty of his clientele will compensate for that long-term bet. The man from the farm has become, without grand speeches, an artisan of constant flavor. Someone who has built his professional identity around a simple and powerful idea, giving the customer an experience they can recognize, with the calm of feeling on familiar ground. And it is precisely that approach that begins to differentiate his shop from the rest, to the point that the name Walker, written on the exterior sign, is no longer just an indication of ownership. but a tacit promise of quality that spreads through Kilmarnock and beyond, as travelers carry news of that well-crafted whiskey. With time, while John's hands show the wear of so many years lifting barrels and writing notes by the light of oil lamps, his gaze becomes more reflective, because he knows that the blend he has perfected through patience cannot depend forever on his intuition. And he begins to share his way of working more openly with his own people, especially with the son who is growing up under his roof, observing everything in silence. The story thus enters a point where the skill of a single man prepares to transform into legacy, and where the idea that that surname might travel farther than the door of his shop no longer seems like such a remote dream. From shopkeeper to last name on the label, over the years, the image of John behind the counter becomes as familiar to the people of Kilmarnock as the church steeple or the smoke rising from the factories at dusk. His figure is no longer that of the insecure young man who came from the farm, but that of a mature man who walks between sacks and barrels with the calm of someone who has survived several bad harvests, changes in the law, unreliable suppliers, and days of weak cash flow. He has found in whiskey a kind of gravitational center for his business, a product that, thanks to his determination, is beginning to develop its own character and generate something increasingly difficult to buy: reputation. This prestige is built discreetly, without grand proclamations, in the way customers repeat their purchases, how they mention the store to family members living in other towns, and in the custom of some traveling merchants who, when passing through Kilmarnock, make a mandatory stop to take home bottles of that well-made whiskey they've heard about in taverns and inns. Slowly, the name Walker begins to appear in conversations that happen far from the street where the store is located. And the brand, although it does not yet exist on paper, is already occupying a place in the collective memory. While this is happening outside, inside the house and the business, Alexander, John's son, is growing up. He is a boy who has his playground in that warehouse full of intense smells and the creaking of wood, who learns to walk among barrels and boxes, who discovers the world by listening to his father argue with suppliers, greet customers, and check accounts at the end of the day. To him, the store is not just a means of livelihood. It is the main stage of his childhood, the place where he understands, almost without realizing it, that money does not appear out of nowhere, that every coin in the cash register represents measurable effort and a right or wrong decision. As Alexander grows, he begins to help with simple tasks, first by organizing shelves, then by helping weigh goods, and later by learning to read the notes his father has been accumulating for years on the different whiskey batches. This silent learning begins to create a key difference between them. John built himself as a merchant through a journey from the farm, with all the weight of change and loss, while his son is shaped directly within the logic of trade. From the beginning, he breathes a world of prices, margins, suppliers, and customers, so that, without ceasing to admire his father's craftsmanship, his mind naturally leans towards the idea of systems and organization. In the relationship between the two, this generational contrast is evident, with fatherhood and succession blending with flour and the scent of malt. While John focuses on perfecting the blend and taking care of the local clientele, Alexander, already a teenager, looks at the map with some ambition. He hears about train routes multiplying, ships sailing from Glasgow or nearby ports to other parts of the empire, merchants moving goods to distances that once seemed impossible, and his imagination begins to entertain a recurring thought. If the people of Kilmarnock appreciate this whiskey, why should it be limited to these few streets? However, before this intuition of expansion can materialize, an intermediate step is required to change the place of the surname in the story. That step comes the day the family realizes that the house whiskey needs something more than strong word of mouth. It needs a visible identity that will accompany it when it leaves the shop. A sign that allows it to be recognized even when it travels far. Until that moment, the bottles have gone back and forth with generic labels, basic indications of content and origin, but nothing that would engrave a clear image in the buyer's mind. In a context where competition begins to organize itself, this lack becomes increasingly evident. The decision to print the surname on the label does not stem from an aesthetic whim, but from many nights of conversation, reviewing how other products are starting to be presented with specific names, and realizing that the prestige of the store is at risk of being diluted when the whiskey crosses its doors. John, who has always had the surname Walker on the exterior sign, understands that if he wants to protect that effort, he must dare to put it on the glass as well. Though he finds it difficult to imagine his name circulating through unknown hands, he accepts that this gesture is necessary for the product to leave behind the category of anonymous merchandise. When the first bottles leave the back room with Walker's Kilmarnock Whiskey written clearly, almost proudly, the mood in the family mixes excitement with vertigo. From that moment on, any defect in the content can no longer simply be attributed to a bad barrel. It will carry the symbolic weight of a surname. And this burden of responsibility pushes everyone to be extra careful with the blend, the bottling, and the selection of suppliers. What's interesting is that, far from paralyzing them, this pressure acts as an additional source of energy, reinforcing the discipline that John has built over the years and offering Alexander a first field of action where he can apply his broader perspective. In everyday life, the effect of the change is immediately noticeable, because customers who used to ask for the house whiskey begin to refer more precisely to Walkers of Kilmarnock. The product separates itself from the physical space of the shop and is now associated with a combination of name and place that gives it a stronger personality, something that can be recommended at a distance with less ambiguity. This opens doors to small deals with taverns, with other merchants, even with travelers who take boxes with the intention of selling them in other towns, confident that the label will be enough of an introduction. For John, accustomed to measuring success based on the loyalty of his neighbors, it feels strange at first to hear that his whiskey is being drunk in cities he has never visited. But Alexander receives this news as confirmation that the path he has in mind is possible. He begins mentally sketching a business that does not rely so much on the volume entering the shop, but on the number of bottles leaving for the world. Though this vision is still in its early stages, it introduces an important nuance. The Walker's surname becomes an asset that can travel without John himself leaving Kilmarnock. The dynamic between father and son is filled with conversations in which respect for well-done work and the desire to take that work further intersect. There are moments of immediate agreement and others in which John's cautious nature clashes with Alexander's contained impatience, as the latter sees opportunities where his father sees risks. The balance between them ends up being one of the great strengths of the family business because the founder's moderation prevents dangerous ventures, while the heir's ambition ensures the shop does not settle into comfort that, with the economic changes of the time, could become very fragile. In terms of identity, this period marks the definitive transition from a whiskey made by such and such a shopkeeper in Kilmarnock to a whiskey called Walker's Kilmarnock. In other words, from a product tied to a specific man to a proposition that can stand alone as its own entity, with a promise that transcends the person. This is fundamental when thinking about the future because the lives of founders are always limited. But a brand can continue to walk for decades, even centuries, if it is cared for as something distinct, yet deeply connected to those who created it. with the surname now printed on the bottles and a new generation looking at the horizon with different eyes. The story enters a phase where the focus begins to shift from the counter to the roots opening beyond Kilmarnock. The family business, which was born as an urgent response to the death of a farmer, is about to become a project that requires thinking about railroads, ships, other countries, commercial laws, and production volumes far higher than what a single shop could comfortably handle. The son who thinks big. When John dies in 1857, the Kilmarnock shop does not stop for a single day. The counter fills again with customers, dust keeps gathering on the high shelves, the barrels keep demanding attention. But something changes in the air. Because the person who now takes the lead is not the same man who spent years perfecting the house blend, but his son Alexander, who has grown up breathing that business and who feels, at the same time, the weight of inheritance and the call of a different era. A stage in which Scotland and the British Empire begin to function as an increasingly connected network through railway lines, sea routes, and flows of goods that cross borders at greater speed. At that moment, Alexander finds himself facing one of those decisions that define a family's history for generations. He can limit himself to preserving what his father left him, carefully managing the shop, maintaining the quality of the whiskey, settling for solid local prestige, or he can read the legacy as a starting point and not as a ceiling, taking on the risk of carrying that surname beyond Kilmarnock, which means stepping into territory that John viewed with caution, such as exportation, increased volume, agreements with distant intermediaries, and the need to further professionalize the structure. Alexander's mindset, forged among account books, news of railway expansion, and conversations with merchants who travel constantly, leans toward this second option. So the business begins to change scale in his head before it changes in reality. He sees the shop as a base of operations, something like a heart that beats in Kilmarnock, but sends blood to many more places. He imagines cases of whiskey bearing the Walker name arriving at ports in England, moving aboard steamships toward colonies of the empire, resting on the shelves of bars in cities where no one has ever heard of the original farm, or of the shy young man who blended barrels in the back room. The first concrete step to make that vision real is to bring order to what already exists. And so, Alexander promotes the formalization of the company under the name John Walker and Sons, a designation that sounds less like a neighborhood shop and more like an organized trading house, capable of signing contracts, managing significant volumes, and presenting itself to distributors as a serious partner. That administrative gesture carries a powerful emotional message because it honors the father by keeping his name at the front, but at the same time establishes that what comes next will be the work of several hands, in which the entire family will have a defined role. While on the office walls, handwritten spreadsheets begin to multiply, with clearer columns, records of suppliers, customers, and volumes. Outside the shop, the world accelerates. Railways reach points once unthinkable. Connections between Kilmarnock, Glasgow, and other industrial centers make the movement of goods easier. And Alexander detects there an opportunity that for John was, to a large extent, a distant rumor. Now it is possible to send cases of whiskey more efficiently, reduce times, coordinate shipments that take advantage of rail routes to ports where steamships no longer depend so much on the whim of the winds. And that completely changes the rules of the game. Unlike other merchants who try to grow by selling anything to anyone, Alexander is clear that his bet rests on a very specific advantage: the quality and consistency of the whiskey his father perfected over years. And for that reason, he decides to double down on that particular product. He builds agreements with distilleries from different regions to secure a stable flow of malts and grains that he can blend under the house standard, because he understands that, To scale, it is not enough to buy whatever appears on the market. It is necessary to guarantee a supply that allows, again and again, the reproduction of that flavor profile people associate with Walker. This approach forces him to think like a conductor rather than a simple reseller. Because he now coordinates notes coming from different distilleries, some specialized in more robust malts, others in smoother grain whiskeys, and his job consists of harmonizing them until the result preserves the personality of the brand, regardless of the specific origin of each batch. In this way, the risk of depending on a single supplier is reduced, and at the same time, the company gains a flexibility that will be key when sales volume grows and demand becomes more demanding. Inside the office, Alexander devotes long hours to reviewing letters, responding to orders, negotiating prices, studying transportation costs carefully so that each case reaches its destination without the margin evaporating along the way. And that image of a man bent over documents, drawing lines, doing calculations, coexists with another very different one, that of the young man who travels to personally know the routes he wants to use, who walks through crowded train stations, who observes the docks of Glasgow or other ports while watching goods from all over the world being loaded and unloaded, thinking that his whiskey can be on those same ships if he makes the right decisions. From the point of view of any entrepreneur, this period is a masterclass in how to transform a craft into a business and a business into a company. Because Alexander understands that the talent for blending, that artisanal sensitivity inherited from his father, must now be accompanied by more complex structures, by rigorous accounting books, by clear agreements with partners, by internal policies on how much stock to keep, how to manage credit for important clients, in which markets to concentrate initial efforts. Each of those decisions draws a trajectory, and although he does not yet know it, he is laying the foundations of a future global brand. The process is not free of tension. Within the family, there are voices that fear so much movement will cause the essence of the business to be lost, that increasing scale will blur the close relationship with Kilmarnock customers, that the risks of non-payment or logistical problems in distant places will end up affecting the heart of the business. But Alexander counters those concerns by constantly reminding them that the blend remains the same, that the surname on the label continues to function as a filter of quality, and that expansion will be gradual, without leaps into the void, always supported by a reputation earned through years of consistency. Meanwhile, in taverns and guest houses in different cities, the name Walker begins to be heard more frequently, no longer as an isolated recommendation, but as a whiskey that certain merchants manage to bring in regularly. And that growing presence in the market reinforces Alexander's conviction that the chosen direction is the right one. The young man who once played among sacks and barrels in his father's shop has managed to transform the scale of his operation, relying as much on the infrastructures of the Industrial Revolution as on a principle that does not change. When someone opens a bottle bearing his surname, they must find inside the character that was promised to them. In that context of growth, the company begins to realize that, to stand out on increasingly crowded shelves, excellent content needs a wrapper worthy of it. And Alexander begins to pay new attention to matters his father considered secondary, such as the shape of the bottle, the design of the label, the way the product is visually presented in a bar or in a shop far from Kilmarnock. Because he understands that, in a world where whiskey travels by trains and ships and is displayed alongside many others, the first battle is often fought with the eyes before it ever reaches the palate. Square bottle, slanted label. In Alexander's mind, the business had long since ceased to be a small town shop with good blends and had become a whiskey house that aspired to travel far. And in that context, there came a moment when he began to look at the bottle with the same seriousness with which his father had looked at the barrels. because he understood that glass was not just a container, but the first silent salesman the customer would encounter on the other side of the world, standing on a crowded shelf, competing at a glance with dozens of alternatives. If we think of a bar at the end of the 19th century, with dark wood, thick tobacco smoke, overlapping conversations, and an almost endless row of cylindrical bottles, all similar to one another, all fighting for space on unstable shelves, we can imagine with considerable precision the problem any brand faced when trying to stand out there. Round shapes rolled easily, knocked into each other, fell over, fitted poorly into crates, wasted space on ships and trains, and every international shipment implied, almost by custom, accepting a certain percentage of broken bottles as an inevitable evil of the trade. Alexander, obsessed with improving both the product and the way it circulated, stopped at that point with the gaze of someone who does not accept things because they have always been done this way. Began to question the logic of those round bottles, mentally reviewed every invoice that showed losses due to breakage, every shipment in which he had been forced to add more straw, more wood, more protection to try to ensure that the blow of a long journey would not turn into shattered glass and spilled whiskey. And from that exercise in nonconformity, a simple and radical idea was born: to change the shape of the container. The square bottle that we would soon associate forever with Johnnie Walker did not appear as an aesthetic whim, but as a pragmatic response to a very concrete, logistical, and economic problem, because a four-sided shape fit better into crates, made it possible to use every centimeter of space on trains and ships more efficiently, reduced play between one bottle and another, minimized movement during transport, and, as a result, reduced the number of pieces broken upon arrival, which meant more product available to sell and less money lost along the way. In addition, day-to-day experience in the Kilmarnock warehouse and at points of sale showed another important benefit. Square bottles stacked with greater stability, turned shelves into more orderly structures, gave a visual sense of firmness, as if each container were anchored more securely to the place it occupied. And this not only reassured those who handled the stock, it also conveyed to customers an impression of care and order that coherently accompanied the message of quality the brand had been building for years from inside the glass. The decision to adopt that shape meant working with glassmakers, experimenting with measurements, checking that the thickness of the glass was adequate to withstand moderate blows without driving production costs through the roof, adjusting the weight so that the crates were not unmanageable, and at the same time making sure that the bottle was comfortable in the bartender's hand, who needed to be able to pour smoothly without awkward postures or discomfort. It was a delicate balance between practical engineering and user experience, and every small change was tested under real conditions, because Alexander knew that bad details are discovered in daily routine, not on paper. The other great success of this stage was understanding that the battle for the customer's attention did not end with the shape of the container, but continued on the surface of the bottle. And this is where the famous slanted label comes into play, an apparently simple design element that would end up becoming one of the most recognizable features of the brand. In a context in which most labels were placed horizontally, with cramped typefaces and overloaded decorations, the decision to place a clean, clear diagonal band crossing the bottle like a signature in motion created an immediate visual break. The slant of that label did not respond solely to a desire to be different. It also had very tangible advantages. By rotating the band, designers could make better use of the front surface of the glass to place larger, more legible text. The name of the house, the origin, the key information that interested the consumer. And at the same time, a sense of dynamism was generated, as if the label itself were stepping forward, breaking away from the rest, catching the eye in a fraction of a second. exactly the amount of time a distracted customer has when scanning a full shelf. In practice, this meant that, in any bar at the Port of London, in a tavern in Liverpool, in a sitting room in some corner of the empire, where light was scarce and distractions were many, there was a greater chance that someone, upon lifting their eyes, would notice that square bottle crowned with a slanted band, remember it, and, at a later moment, ask for it by name. Even if they could not explain why that container had stayed with them more strongly than the others. At heart, what was being done was working on the consumer's visual memory in a very sophisticated way for the time. From the back room of the company, the change was experienced as an act of bravery, because modifying a container means taking on the risk of inconveniencing those who are already accustomed to a previous form. However, the results in sales and perception quickly compensated for those initial doubts. The bottles arrived in better condition in distant markets, were easy to organize in venues. Distributors found economic sense in the decision, and most importantly, the brand was distinguishing itself in the public's mind, which began to inseparably associate Walker's whiskey with that unmistakable silhouette. For anyone thinking about starting a business today, the lesson is clear and is worth as much as a modern marketing treatise, because what Alexander and his team did at that moment was to think of the entire product as an experience that began long before the first sip. They understood that design can be a tool for cost reduction, logistical improvement, aesthetic differentiation, and brand building at the same time, as long as it is approached with a strategic mindset and not as mere ornament, and that the shape of a bottle can change the history of a company when it responds to real business problems. From that point on, the company no longer saw the bottle as a static element, but as something alive, open to new ideas, a field in which to continue innovating according to how markets and tastes evolved. Although the core of the proposal, the combination of square shape and diagonal label, would remain as a kind of permanent signature, a mark of identity that would make Johnnie Walker recognizable at any bar in the world, even to someone who had never seen an advertisement or read a story about its origins. While glass and paper were taking on this leading role, new plans continued to appear in the office to organize the catalog, order the different expressions of the house whiskey, and offer the public a clearer structure of options. Because as the brand conquered shelves, it became increasingly necessary to explain precisely which version of Walker each customer was buying, and what character they could expect from it, based on the color and the name that appeared on the label. The birth of colors, red and black. At the end of the 19th century, when the square bottle and the slanted label had already begun to travel across half the world, the Walker House found itself facing a new challenge, less visible than glass, yet just as important. How to organize its own range without losing people in a labyrinth of long names and hard-to-grasp nuances, because success had brought an inevitable side effect. The catalog was growing. Different expressions of the house whiskey were appearing, and the way of naming them was beginning to show its limits. In the early decades, the firm had relied on respectable but somewhat cumbersome denominations, with expressions such as Old Highland Whiskey, Special Old Highland, and Extra Special Old Highland, labels that tried to create a hierarchy among products by appealing to tradition and prestige, yet demanded from the consumer an effort of memory and a certain patience to tell them apart. For anyone stepping into a crowded bar, with the mind busy with the noise of the day, remembering whether what they had drunk the previous week was the plain Old Highland or the Special Old Highland could become an unnecessarily complicated exercise. Inside the company, the men who held the reins understood that the world opening up before them did not allow for such distractions, because whiskey was no longer sold only at the bar where the bartender knew everyone by name. It was beginning to circulate in markets where the brand had to stand on its own without the support of a detailed explanation. In places where English lived alongside other languages, where the speed of consumption required that the decision be made in a matter of seconds, guided by a quick, almost instinctive impression, which made it clear that simplification was necessary, making the range more intuitive, easier to remember and to recommend. The key appeared in something as elementary as the use of color, that tool human beings have been using for millions of years to orient themselves in nature, and that, when intelligently applied to the commercial world, can become a universal language, more powerful than an entire paragraph of adjectives. The idea of associating each whiskey expression with a clearly differentiated color gained ground, and little by little, Old Highland, Special Old Highland, and Extra Special Old Highland gave way to a naming system that stuck in the mind with astonishing naturalness. Red Label, Black Label, and later other colors that would expand the sensory map of the brand. The move had a tremendously powerful logic. On the one hand, it allowed the range to be grouped and ordered in a clear way, each color representing a personality, an intensity, an occasion for consumption. On the other, it freed the consumer from the burden of having to remember long names. It was enough to know whether one was a red person or a black person, whether one was in a moment of carefree celebration or in a night that called for a deeper, more contemplative drink. And that simplification did not mean giving up the richness of the product. Rather, it made it accessible without renouncing the mystery that always surrounds a good whiskey. Red Label was conceived as the workhorse, the versatile, vibrant blend designed to travel, to withstand mixing, to accompany everyday moments and noisy parties. It was the whiskey that reached distant ports and was served with soda, with ice, with ginger ale. The one that moved easily through the hands of bartenders who needed speed. The one a sailor, a merchant, or an office worker could order without feeling they were stepping into territory reserved for connoisseurs. Its profile aimed at a broad, open audience, at consumers who wanted flavor with character but were not willing to turn every glass into a solemn ceremony. Black Label, by contrast, was born with a different tone in its soul. Its place was a little higher on the ladder of aspiration, a more complex blend, aged for more years, designed for those who sought to stop time for a minute, to appreciate layers of flavor, to notice how the liquid filled the mouth with a different depth. It became the whiskey someone brought out on a special occasion, the one given as a gift to celebrate a promotion, a well-closed deal, a long-awaited meeting, the one drunk more slowly, with less noise around, letting smoke, fruit, and wood tell their own story to whoever leaned toward the glass. This duality between red and black began to organize the brand's imagery in people's minds, so that anywhere on the planet where someone was familiar with Johnnie Walker, it was enough to ask whether they were red or black, to understand something important about their relationship with whiskey, almost as if the choice of a color revealed a small trait of personality. For the company, that effect had enormous value because it turned the range into a simple mental map, easy to transmit, ideal for bartenders to explain quickly and for customers to remember effortlessly. On the design front, this step was reflected in labels that, without losing the characteristic diagonal, forcefully incorporated the corresponding color, so that the shelf of a bar or a liquor store became a kind of board where the eye immediately distinguished the red and black bands, repeating an image that fixed itself in the retina with each visit. The square bottle, which was already a powerful differentiating element, found in these colors a perfect ally, and together they made Johnnie Walker almost impossible to confuse on any bar in the world. For distributors and salespeople, the new structure brought a very effective communication tool. They could now tell the story of the brand using a simple scheme, almost as if they were explaining two chapters of the same book. One more extroverted, expansive, associated with Red Label, and another more introspective, deep, associated with Black Label. And from that base suggest which bottle best fit the occasion, the budget, the customer's taste, which greatly facilitated the task of recommending without overwhelming with technical speeches. From the entrepreneur's perspective, the move teaches something fundamental. Sometimes growth does not mean adding layers of complexity, but being able to organize what is already there, to present it in a way that reduces the customer's mental effort. Because in a world saturated with stimuli, purchasing decisions are made with a mix of intuition and cognitive shortcuts. And the mission of whoever designs a brand is to offer those shortcuts without betraying the depth of the product. In this case, the Walker House achieved it, transforming a range that could be confusing into a color system that spoke an almost universal language. With red and black walking the world, the brand entered a new phase. It was no longer enough to be present on the shelves. Something more was needed. A story, a figure, a human symbol that embodied that idea of continuous advance, of progress, of moving forward that the company had been practicing in the shadows for decades. Since those days when a shopkeeper from Kilmarnock decided to blend barrels to give his neighbors a reliable flavor. And at that moment, as the colors settled into the minds of consumers, the appearance of a character began to take shape. One who, with a single elegant step, was going to turn whiskey into much more than a drink. The man who walks appears. At the beginning of the 20th century, when the name Johnnie Walker had already learned to move with ease among ports, stations, and bars across half the planet, the brand found itself at a curious point in its history, because it had a solid product, an unmistakable bottle, and a color architecture that helped organize the consumer's mind. But it lacked something that would become decisive in the era that was opening. A face, a figure, a human symbol capable of condensing into a single image everything the company wanted to represent. The idea of progress, of determination, of constant movement forward. The advertisements of the time were quite static. Solemn illustrations predominated, idealized landscapes, very formal tasting scenes. And in that visual environment, the Walker House began to wonder to what extent it was capable of conveying something more than quality and tradition. Because, no matter how valuable the contents of the bottle were, the world of advertising was filling up with characters, with emblems that seemed to have a life of their own, and that stayed in the memory as much as the products they accompanied. So the brand needed, in some way, to create a protagonist. It is in that context, around 1908, when Tom Brown enters the scene. A renowned caricaturist, accustomed to drawing quick scenes, figures with character, people who could be recognized by a gesture or by a posture, even before their facial features. Legend has it that, at a lunch with people from the Walker House, someone asked him to imagine a personification of the whiskey, something that captured the spirit of the brand. And Brown, who had a loose stroke and an imagination always alight, leaned over a napkin and began to slide his pen without too much ceremony, like someone playing, without suspecting that he was creating one of the most enduring icons in the history of marketing. From that quick stroke was born a stylized gentleman, with a top hat, cane, elegant boots, and a cape that seemed to billow even though the paper was still. A man who did not pose motionless for the viewer, but instead advanced with one leg forward, as if he were crossing the frame of the drawing, determined, confident, with a smile that suggested he knew where he was going. The gesture encapsulated without words the idea of walking toward the future with confidence, and the brand team, upon seeing that figure, immediately recognized that there was something there that connected perfectly with the essence of what they had been selling for decades. That character was christened the Striding Man, the man who takes the long step, and he began to populate advertisements, posters, labels, promotional materials, until he became an almost inseparable companion to the bottle, a visual guide that led the consumer toward the brand. What is fascinating is that unlike other symbols of the time, which could seem rigid or overly serious, this walking man had a touch of irony, of lightness, of contained joy, which made it possible for him to work both in formal contexts and in more relaxed scenes, adapting to the diversity of situations in which the whiskey could appear. Alongside him, the Walker House adopted a phrase that condensed a century of history into a few words. Born 1820, still going strong. A declaration that turned the whiskey into something almost biographical, as if one were speaking of a person who had crossed decades and was still standing, gaining vigor with time. That combination of a figure that advanced and a motto that claimed resistance to the passage of years finished fixing in the public mind a powerful idea. Johnnie Walker was not only a whiskey, it was a trajectory, a story of perseverance. In the printed advertisements of the time, the Striding Man could be seen walking through diverse landscapes, sometimes accompanied by phrases that played with the concept of progress, of changing jobs, of moving up the social ladder, of leaving behind old limitations, as if the brand wanted to associate its consumption with the feeling of moving forward in life, of not remaining anchored in a place that no longer corresponded. It was not an explicit message of, "Drink this and you will succeed." It was something more subtle, an idea of companionship along the road, of reward for effort, of celebrating each step forward, large or small. From the perspective of brand building, what happens here is crucial. The product ceases to be represented solely by its packaging and its name, and acquires an avatar, a kind of permanent ambassador who can travel anywhere, speak in graphics, in lithographs, even in the imagination of whoever remembers it, without the need for a bottle to be present. This allows the company to build campaigns that tell small stories with the Striding Man as the protagonist, stories in which, more or less explicitly, the idea is underscored that whoever chooses that whiskey identifies with the attitude of the character, with his determined stride. Over time, the man who walks would change slightly in style, adapting his clothing and his line to the graphic fashions of each era, without losing the basic gesture of forward motion, which demonstrates another interesting lesson for any entrepreneur thinking about visual identity. A strong symbol can evolve without losing its essence, as long as the structure that makes it recognizable remains intact. In this case, the moving silhouette, the cane, the hat, the inclination of the body toward a future that cannot be seen, but is sensed in the direction of the step. In pubs and in the salons of many cities, the Striding Man began to hang on walls, to appear on silk-screened mirrors, on clocks, on posters that adorned the venues, and little by little people grew accustomed to seeing him, to the point that, even without reading the name, it was enough to find that elongated figure in a corner of the bar to know that Johnnie Walker was served there. The brand had managed, with a simple drawing born on a napkin, to buy a permanent space in the everyday landscape of millions of people, something that today many companies pursue with gigantic investments, and that then emerged from a meeting between artisanal creativity and business vision. For the Walker House itself, the appearance of this character also meant a way of organizing its discourse inward and outward, because the "keep walking" that decades later would become famous as a slogan was already, in some way, hinted at in the figure that advanced without stopping. The company could look at itself in that mirror and ask whether it was honoring the implicit promise in its icon, whether it was still walking, innovating, expanding horizons, or whether it risked settling. And that internal question helped them maintain an attitude of search and expansion even in moments when the environment invited retreat. In narrative terms, the striding man turned the whiskey into the protagonist of a kind of novel in motion, where each new country it reached, each crisis overcome, each change in the product range, could be understood as one more step in the journey of that gentleman who crossed borders and eras with his cane and his smile. And that allowed the brand to pass through very turbulent decades, with wars, partial prohibitions, changes of government and customs, without losing its guiding thread, always relying on the idea that whatever happened, one had to keep moving forward. From here, the story becomes broader, because the man who walks does not do so on immobile ground, but on a world that is about to enter one of the most convulsive stages of its history. With empires expanding, global conflicts, laws that will change the way alcohol is produced and consumed, and markets that will open and close like capricious doors. In the midst of that unstable landscape, Johnnie Walker will have to prove that its promise of remaining on its feet was not just a clever phrase, but a real strategy for surviving the blows of history. Empire, wars, and liquid resilience. As the calendar approaches 1910, the world seems to spin faster than any previous generation had ever known. The British Empire stretches its commercial tentacles across all continents. Steamships cross oceans with almost mechanical regularity. Railway networks stitch together territories that once seemed forever distant. And in that landscape of cables, coal, and smoke, the square bottles of Johnnie Walker already travel as regular passengers, stacked in crates that carry the Walker surname stamped on them almost like a glass passport. The commercial map of the brand widens in an impressive way. Records speak of a presence in dozens and dozens of countries, with particular strength in those ports where the empire maintains strategic bases. From the bustling docks of London and Liverpool to colonial enclaves in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, so that the same red label can end up on the table of a British club in Calcutta, in the living room of a ship owner in Cape Town, or on the bar of an elegant hotel in Buenos Aires, always with the same promise of recognizable flavor, as if a piece of Scotland were traveling in miniature inside each bottle. This expansion does not happen by magic. Behind it lies extraordinary logistical discipline, agreements with local distributors, constant adaptations to different legislations, efforts to maintain quality in very different climates. From the suffocating humidity of the tropics to the dry cold of certain northern destinations, and at the same time, an enormous capacity to listen to what is happening in each market. Because the company receives continuous news about how whiskey is consumed in every place, which blends work best, which labels generate the most curiosity, and what type of consumer is approaching the brand. However, all that seemingly unstoppable machinery soon faces a kind of test that does not appear in any accounting book. The outbreak of the First World War, with its train of destruction, rationing, uncertainty, and shifting priorities. From one day to the next, ships are no longer only commercial vehicles. Armies need them. Routes become dangerous. Insurance costs soar. Trade is disrupted, and the company that had learned to depend on that global network is forced to recalculate quickly, to understand where it can continue to ship product, which markets freeze, and which ones become temporary refuges. In those dark years, the bottle ceases, in many cases, to be an object associated with noisy celebration and becomes a symbol of comfort, something that appears in the luggage of officers going to the front, in rear area bars where moments of respite are sought, in homes where someone waits for news and fills the silence with a gesture as old as sharing a drink. Sales volumes suffer significant ups and downs. Production has to adapt to limitations of raw materials and transport. But the brand manages to stay afloat, supported by the diversity of its markets and by a resilience born of decades of reinvestment and prudence. While Europe trembles, another phenomenon alters the landscape of the alcohol business: prohibition in the United States, which comes into force in 1920 and bans the production, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages in one of the potentially largest markets in the world. A blow that affects the entire sector and forces companies to sharpen their ingenuity. In the case of Johnnie Walker, the strategy involves strengthening its position in other territories, consolidating its image in spaces where drinking remains legal, and waiting with icy patience for that prohibition to end. Because the company understands that laws may change, but the habits and desires of people tend to have a longer memory. The decade of 1920 advances like a roller coaster, with moments of economic euphoria and others of concern. And in the midst of that oscillation, the brand continues to refine its international presence, caring for its reputation in places where it can still operate with relative normality, building a base of loyal customers who do not depend on the latest fashion, but on accumulated trust. When the crash of '29 arrives and the Great Depression shakes the foundations of Western capitalism, the luxury market suffers. Many businesses tied to aspirational consumption wobble. But Walker Whiskey has an advantage. It has positioned itself both in festive contexts and in moments of refuge, and that duality allows it to continue finding space in people's lives. In those years, while lines in front of failed banks become a common image in newspapers, the company focuses on protecting what is essential, adjusting production, avoiding reckless financial adventures, maintaining its network of contacts in good condition, and above all, not betraying the promise of quality that has made it strong. In times of crisis, the consumer may reduce spending, may space out occasions of consumption, but when they decide to buy something they perceive as special, they demand that it live up to expectations. And that is precisely the foundation on which Johnnie Walker manages not to disappear from the map. In 1934, in the midst of economic turbulence, a milestone occurs that is more symbolic than directly related to sales volume, but whose impact on brand perception is enormous. The house receives the royal warrant from King George V, a kind of royal seal that recognizes it as an official supplier to the British royal household, which means that, in addition to being present in bars of distant ports and in middle-class living rooms, Walker Whiskey occupies a place at the table of the family that institutionally embodies the empire. That distinction acts as a certificate of prestige that the company uses intelligently in its communication, reinforcing the idea that its product has earned the trust of those who can choose anything. But the world grants no long pauses, and just a few years later, the outbreak of the Second World War once again turns everything upside down. Ships become military targets, supplies are rationed, factories adapt to the needs of war, and international trade becomes a constant balancing act between survival and collaboration with war efforts. For a global company like Johnnie Walker, the impact is significant. Many routes are interrupted, certain markets disappear temporarily, production adjusts to the priorities of the moment. But the brand has learned, since the First World War, that diversification and financial prudence are the best tools to get through these periods without sinking. In those years of blackouts and sirens, the striding man continues to appear in some materials, almost as a reminder of a time when walking forward was synonymous with commercial expansion, and his presence is redefined. It becomes a symbol of tenacity, of the ability to keep moving even when the ground shakes. because the message of the brand goes beyond the act of selling bottles and turns into a kind of statement of character. To remain standing, to regroup, to adapt one's stride to the storm without losing sight of the horizon. When the war ends, the world is left unrecognizable in many ways. Political maps are redrawn, the British Empire enters a slow process of transformation, colonies begin to claim independence. Emerging powers change the rules of international trade. And any company that wants to remain alive has to understand that the future will no longer resemble the past, no matter how successful that past may have been. In that context, Johnnie Walker, far from retreating into nostalgia, decides to use its experience of navigating crises as a competitive advantage. It has learned to move in uncertain environments and prepares to take advantage of the growth of new middle classes on different continents. The whiskey continues to travel by ship and train. But now it does so in a world where the old language of empire is no longer sufficient to explain things, and the brand adapts. It learns to speak to consumers who relate to it through their own stories, not through British identity, develops strategies to position itself as a symbol of personal achievement in countries that want to define themselves outside the colonial shadow. And all of this rests on the same foundation as always. A recognizable blend, a solid bottle, a walking icon, and a proven ability to adjust the sails when the wind changes. If we look at this stretch of history with business-oriented eyes, what we see is a very rare combination of boldness and patience, of global ambition and operational prudence, a constant game between growth and protection, between occupying new spaces and withstanding the blows of an era in which almost nothing could be taken for granted. And as the 20th century moves toward its midpoint, with large companies in the sector reorganizing, merging, and seeking economies of scale, the name Johnnie Walker prepares to integrate into even larger corporate structures, without losing the personality that was born in a small shop in Kilmarnock and was tested battle by battle in every corner of the world where someone raised a glass to toast, even in the darkest years. From family home to global giant, when the world moves fully into the second half of the 20th century, the business story of whiskey no longer advances at the unhurried pace of the old merchants who traveled by train, but instead moves forward driven by large corporations, strategic mergers, expanding markets, and an alcohol industry that begins to behave like a global ecosystem, full of alliances and decisions made in offices far removed from those where John and Alexander Walker patiently blended barrels by hand. In that landscape of corporations that grow by absorbing brands, refining processes, and expanding their distribution networks with the logic of industrial engineering, the name Johnnie Walker is about to experience a leap that will forever change its scale and its destiny. From the early 1920s, the family company had been gradually professionalizing its structure, adapting to the changes brought by wars, competition, and the increase in international demand. Whiskey traveled along broader routes, appeared in bars in cities that had not previously figured on commercial maps, and the brand had become a recognizable product for consumers in countries with very different cultures and economies. However, to survive in the new world order that took shape after the Second World War, more was required than historical prestige and talent for blending. Alliances were needed, capital, access to stable raw materials, and a distribution network so solid that it could withstand economic crises, legislative changes, and brutal fluctuations in international trade. It is in this context that, in 1925, a decisive step is taken. John Walker & Sons becomes part of Distillers Company Limited, one of the most influential corporations in the sector. This move responds not only to a logic of growth, but to the need to guarantee the continuous supply of malts and grain whiskies, to secure access to distilleries from different regions, and to protect production capacity against possible interruptions in the chain. For a company that had built its success on the consistency of the blend, having at its disposal a broad portfolio of distilleries was a colossal advantage. Within Distillers Company Limited, the Walker brand acquires a new status. It is no longer merely a flagship product within a family catalog, but a strategic piece within the larger machinery of the Scottish industry. The parent company begins to invest in improving processes, securing inventories, optimizing maturation, acquiring key distilleries such as Cardhu, one of the backbones of future blends, and strengthening the presence of others such as Talisker, Mortlach, or Clinalish, whose profiles add depth to the character of the whiskey that travels with the diagonal label. Each of these acquisitions has a clear purpose: to guarantee a sufficiently broad range of flavors, to ensure continuity in blending, and to shield the product against events that might affect production in any one region. Meanwhile, in markets around the world, the square bottle continues to make its way forward, supported by an increasingly sophisticated distribution network. In Latin America, Asia, and Africa, where whiskey consumption begins to grow strongly, the brand finds itself in privileged positions thanks to the logistics and financial strength of Distillers Company Limited. This international presence allows it to survive volatile periods in Europe, offsetting declines in some countries with growth in others. The company learns to play with economic geography, understanding that its success depends on the ability to adapt to very diverse realities, from hotel bars in major cities to small shops in remote ports. The second half of the 20th century is marked by a profound global economic transformation. Industrial corporations begin to merge in search of efficiencies that allow them to compete in increasingly demanding markets. In this context, Distillers Company Limited is acquired in 1986 by Guinness, the historic Irish brewing company, a union that creates a beverage giant with an impressive catalog. This move is, in itself, a demonstration of the kind of corporate power that dominates the era. Companies that once belonged to different worlds, such as whiskey and stout beer, now form part of a conglomerate that operates on a planetary scale. Ordinary consumers hardly notice this change in their daily lives. Because the bottle remains square, the label remains slanted, and the striding man continues walking in advertisements and posters. However, behind that appearance of continuity, the corporate structure is radically different, filled with new processes, more sophisticated production technologies, quality control systems that benefit from experience accumulated in parallel industries, and a global vision that looks beyond the present, thinking in decades ahead with an almost military strategy. The definitive milestone arrives in 1997, when Guinness merges with the multinational Grand Metropolitan, giving birth to Diageo, one of the largest beverage companies on the planet. This new corporation, with a presence on virtually every continent and a portfolio that ranges from spirits and beers to wines and ready-to-drink beverages, turns Johnnie Walker into one of its strategic jewels, a product that represents not only sales, but identity, tradition, and international recognition. From this moment on, the brand becomes part of a corporate universe with virtually unlimited resources for marketing, innovation, expansion, and the protection of its legacy. The entry into Diageo marks a before and after in several respects. On one hand, the brand gains access to a global distribution network capable of placing bottles in locations where it would previously have been difficult, from massive airports to small villages with active trade. On the other hand, it receives constant investment in increasingly ambitious advertising campaigns, more advanced production technologies, rigorous quality controls, and heritage management projects, such as investing in visitor experiences at distilleries, modernizing infrastructure, and protecting the supply chain on a large scale. But perhaps most importantly, from that integration onward, the brand becomes immune to many of the fragilities that characterize family companies, which, no matter how talented they may be, are always exposed to succession issues, internal tensions, limited access to capital, and vulnerability to deep economic crises. Johnnie Walker, within Diageo, becomes a stable force, capable of planning for the long term, weathering economic storms, and investing in innovation without having to put its structure at risk. Paradoxically, the larger the corporate group becomes, the more care it takes in preserving the essence of the whiskey that, in the end, supports everything else. The diversity of distilleries under the Diageo umbrella allows the master blenders, the guardians of flavor, to work with an enormous palette of malts and grains, making it possible to maintain the original promise of the blend. A whiskey that tastes like itself, regardless of where in the world the bottle is opened or the year in which it was bottled. With this transformation, the history of Johnnie Walker is rewritten on an industrial scale, without losing its artisanal roots. And as the company settles into a business landscape dominated by giants, the next chapter begins to emerge, because growth will not stop here. The brand is about to expand into more exclusive territories, where luxury and experimentation will open new doors in the architecture of whiskey. The constellation of premium labels. When Johnnie Walker fully enters the era of large conglomerates, with Diageo as an umbrella and a global network that places its bottles in practically every airport, hotel, or important bar on the planet, a silent question arises in the offices where strategic decisions are made. What to do with a brand that is already omnipresent, that already sells massively, that already has its visual uniform perfectly installed in the consumer's mind? The answer is not to change what works, but to add new layers, to open a second floor in the building of the brand, a level designed for those who want something more exclusive than the familiar red and black. A territory where whiskey becomes an object of desire, collection, and status. The global context supports this ambition. From the 1980s onward, and especially in the 1990s, a middle and upper class grows that is willing to pay more for experiences it perceives as unique. Consumers appear who already have their basic needs covered and begin to look for products that allow them to mark subtle differences, celebrate special moments, or give a gift that speaks well of them. Luxury stops being a distant niche and begins to mix with popular culture. Airports fill with duty-free shops where people pass the time looking at display cases packed with striking bottles. And there, Johnnie Walker sees a perfect stage to deploy something that had been decades in the making. A true constellation of premium labels. In that firmament, the star that shines brightest is Blue Label, the bottle that, since its launch in the decade of the 1990s, presents itself almost as a declaration of principles, a kind of love letter to the past mixed with a direct bet on the luxury segment. The proposal is clear. A blend built from exceptional casks, chosen from the oldest and scarcest stocks, presented as a tribute to the way whiskey was blended in the 19th century, when productions were smaller and barrel selection was almost surgical. The message does not limit itself to saying it is more expensive just because, but instead builds a narrative of rarity and extreme care, wrapped in a more robust bottle, in a box that opens as if it were guarding a jewel, and in details such as the individual number of each unit, which reinforce the feeling that one is not buying a standard product, but a singular piece. Blue Label quickly becomes the whiskey of major occasions, the signing of important contracts, weddings where someone wants to surprise the best man, corporate gifts that seek to impress without the need for too many words, celebrations of round anniversaries in which, for once, something is opened that is usually kept in the cabinet. For many consumers, that blue bottle functions as a kind of goal, an objective that may not be purchased every month, but is reserved in the mind for that moment when one feels they have reached a personal or professional milestone. And in business terms, that means the brand has achieved something extremely powerful, transforming a product into a symbol of achievement. Around this summit, other steps are arranged because a ladder of aspiration needs more than 2 rungs. For years, Gold Label occupies a very interesting place. Conceived as a whiskey for celebration, silky, designed for toasting and sharing. With a positioning that places it above the classic black, but below the almost mythical blue, Green Label, for its part, plays a different card, that of speaking to the more technical enthusiast, the one who is no longer satisfied with a good blend and wants to understand that in their glass there is a mixture of malts from different regions, without grain whiskey, with a more marked character and a story that appeals to the diversity of the Scottish landscape. Around them appear, over time, proposals such as Platinum or the 18-year-old, versions that further refine the discourse of prolonged maturation and complexity. The company does not limit itself to launching products and giving them evocative names. It builds a true brand architecture, a kind of map that allows the consumer to place themselves within the Johnnie Walker galaxy. At the base, Red Label as a battle companion, a versatile blend for everyday life, for mixed drinks, for bustling bars. A little higher up, Black Label as a bridge toward something deeper, the whiskey that is already served with more calm, that is given as a gift to someone appreciated, that works equally well at home as in an elegant club. And then, successive steps that raise the level of rarity, cask time, and refinement until crowning in the blue. That place where the price makes it clear that the boundary of the everyday has been crossed. What is interesting is that this ladder is not built only with age and marketing, but with genuine work of blending and selection. The master blenders of the house, heirs to that obsession of John with consistency, now face a double challenge: to maintain the historical profiles of red and black, which cannot fail, and at the same time to design superior expressions that respect the brand's DNA, and at the same time offer new experiences. Each new launch involves hours of tasting, trials with malts from different distilleries, debates about which aromatic note should dominate, what degree of smokiness is appropriate, how much cask time adds complexity without killing balance. The public may not see that sensory laboratory, but they perceive it when they lift the glass and feel that the promise of exclusivity has substance. To this range, strategy has added another very effective resource in the modern era: limited and commemorative editions. The brand begins to play with launches linked to anniversaries, cities, artistic collaborations, or cultural milestones, each with a particular bottle design, a specific story, and, many times, limited productions that spark the interest of the collector. Suddenly, whiskey stops being only something that is drunk and becomes also something that is kept, displayed, and in some cases, increases in value over time, which opens a completely new dimension in the consumer's relationship with the brand. In airports, this strategy can be seen very clearly. Duty-free areas fill with towers of Johnnie Walker with bottles that perhaps are not found so easily in traditional retail, presented in striking cases, with references to travel, maps, routes, iconic cities. The traveler, tired, with hours of waiting ahead, finds themselves surrounded by that constellation of labels and feels that they can take with them a piece of portable luxury. Something that tells a different story from the bottle they already know from the supermarket. For the company, that space is a privileged stage where it can educate the public, show them the complete ladder, and tempt them to climb one more rung. From an entrepreneurial point of view, what Johnnie Walker puts into practice here is an advanced manual on how to manage the vertical growth of a brand without betraying its base. Instead of abandoning the loyal consumer to pursue only the premium segment, it builds bridges. Whoever starts with red can move up to black without a feeling of rupture. Whoever becomes accustomed to black can one day dare to try gold or 18-year-old. And whoever falls in love with the universe of the brand ends up glancing sideways at Blue Label the way one looks at a sports car in a display window, knowing that it may not be for today, but it is also not outside the map of what is possible. That logic of accompanying the customer through different stages of their life expands the value of each person over time and creates bonds that transcend the one-time purchase. All this display of labels, colors, years, and special editions has, at its core, a narrative objective: to reinforce the idea that the brand has not stood still, that it keeps walking, exploring new territories, trying different forms of expression, from the discreet luxury of a blue bottle to the boldness of thematic collaborations that dialogue with cinema, series, or contemporary art. And for that constant movement not to be perceived only through the product, a more direct message was needed. A phrase capable of condensing into words what the striding man had been suggesting with his gesture since the beginning of the 20th century. An invitation to keep moving forward that would end up marking an entire era in the communication of the brand. We stir, keep walking. When the logo speaks, as the end of the 20th century approached, with globalization advancing at a pace that seemed to erase borders and consumers exposed to a colossal volume of advertising stimuli, brands began to understand that the battle for attention could no longer be fought solely with eye-catching colors, memorable designs, or famous faces. Something different was needed. A phrase? A central idea that could function as an emotional compass. A message capable of accompanying people in their daily lives and connecting with them beyond the moment they raised a glass. Johnnie Walker, with more than 100 years of history and an icon that had been walking for decades, had all the necessary elements to make that narrative leap. And it did so with a campaign that would redefine its identity. The famous "Keep Walking." The phrase appeared in the late 1990s, in a context in which the brand was looking for a way to update its image without breaking with its legacy. The striding man remained a powerful symbol, recognizable in any corner of the world. But until that moment, his message had been more implicit than explicit. It was suggested by his posture, by the cane angled forward, by the determined gesture. Yet there was no line that put words to that movement. "Keep walking" arrived like a moment of clarity. 3 words, 11 letters, a verb that does not describe a state but a constant action, a call to move forward. The campaign suggested that walking was not simply about moving from one place to another, but a way of inhabiting life. A commitment to progress, an essential impulse that connects people beyond cultural differences. The advertising pieces that accompanied this new stage had an aesthetic different from that of previous decades. Instead of focusing exclusively on the bottle or on environments associated with luxury, the advertisements filled with human scenes. People starting projects, overcoming losses, changing direction, reinventing themselves after a fall. For the first time, whiskey became a symbolic companion, not because it promised to transform the consumer's life, but because it represented an act of perseverance. The brand stopped talking about itself and began talking about people. In that sense, the campaign functioned almost like a manifesto, an open invitation to interpret the act of walking as a form of resistance in the face of the modern world, where changes are abrupt, challenges inevitable, and moving forward at times, the only guarantee of meaning. The reinterpretation of the striding man was also part of this rebirth. For decades, the character had been a gentleman with Victorian airs, elegant, almost aristocratic, designed for a time when advertising spoke from a reverential distance. With the new century just around the corner, the brand decided to update him, make him more dynamic, soften certain features, move him away from the rigidity of the original illustrator without losing his essence. The most significant change was his direction. For years, the character had advanced toward the left side of the viewer, which in Western terms evoked a walk toward the past. With the arrival of Keep Walking, the striding man turned to the right, toward that space the eyes interpret as the future. It was a subtle, almost silent decision, but one loaded with meaning. The character who had accompanied generations now aligned himself with the natural sense of the phrase, visually reinforcing the idea of continuity. The impact of this campaign was felt in very different markets. In Asia, where aspirational brands occupy an important symbolic place, Keep Walking was interpreted as a message of personal improvement in societies undergoing major economic transformations. In Latin America, the phrase resonated in a context where individual effort is often accompanied by social challenges, becoming a kind of everyday motto. In Europe, where alcohol advertising had begun to face stricter regulations, the campaign managed to remain relevant by betting more on human values than on direct consumption. The message, flexible and powerful, adapted to each culture without demanding literal translations. Because the idea of moving forward, even when the path becomes dark, is universal. One of the most memorable gestures of this period was the creation of the mini-documentary, The Man Who Walked Around the World, starring the Scottish actor Robert Carlyle. The piece consisted of a single continuous shot of about 6 minutes in which Carlyle walked along a rural path while narrating the history of the brand, with a tone somewhere between epic and intimate, a narrative balance that is difficult to achieve. The actor moved forward without stopping, as if his stride set the rhythm of the story itself, linking anecdotes, dates, characters, crises, and triumphs with the naturalness of someone telling a lived story. The piece won awards, spread widely before the word viral was as common as it is today, and consolidated something essential. The idea of moving forward was at the very heart of Johnnie Walker's identity. The importance of this campaign is not limited to advertising. It influenced how the company made strategic decisions. The message of moving forward with determination became a kind of internal North Star, a philosophy that guided investments, launches, changes in processes, innovations in packaging, and cultural partnerships. For a brand with such a long legacy, the risk of falling into self-satisfaction is always present. But Keep Walking functioned as an antidote, reminding everyone that honoring the past does not mean being trapped in it. The company also took advantage of the narrative potential of the slogan to connect with social causes, collaborating with projects linked to personal progress, education, empowerment, and professional mobility. These collaborations reinforced the perception that the phrase was not merely a marketing strategy, but a message aligned with a contemporary vision of what it means to be a global brand with cultural responsibility. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this stage teaches a very valuable lesson. The brands that survive are those capable of turning their history into a living impulse. It is not enough to have traveled the world for a century. It is necessary to find a way to continue having something to say to people. The coherence between the message and the visual identity, the emotional tone and corporate behavior, made "Keep Walking" not just a slogan, but a pact with the viewer. A promise of constant movement, and while the slogan was becoming firmly established in campaigns, another dimension of the brand was beginning to gain strength in parallel. A dimension in which whiskey appears not only in advertisements, but in film scenes, in iconic series, in fictional universes where the striding man may not walk, but the square bottle is instantly recognized as a cultural symbol. Cinema, series, and pop culture. When a brand has been walking for more than a century, there comes a moment when it stops living only in display cases, advertisements, and bars, and begins to appear in places where people truly feel emotion, those territories where stories stick to memory, which are cinema, series, songs, novels, that entire ecosystem we call pop culture, and that, in the end, defines how we imagine the world. In that terrain, Johnnie Walker makes a leap that many companies desire and few achieve. Its bottle stops being merely an object of consumption and becomes a symbol that directors use to say things without the need for explicit dialogue. One of the most iconic examples happens in 1982, when Ridley Scott releases Blade Runner, that film which almost invents a way of seeing the future as something wet, decadent, luminous, and sad at the same time, with neon lights flickering over a chaotic city and, in the middle of that landscape, a detail that brand enthusiasts recognize instantly. On the table of Rick Deckard, the protagonist played by Harrison Ford, there appears a bottle of Johnnie Walker designed especially for the film. An angular, almost futuristic piece that seems to come as much from the mind of an architect as from that of a master blender. That bottle, with its discreet yet forceful presence, says something important. Even in a dark future, there are traditions that survive. And Walker whiskey is suggested as a bridge between the world we know and that world that does not yet exist. That kind of appearance is not accidental. Behind it, there are decisions, conversations, agreements. But above all, there is a very refined understanding of what it means to be present in the stories the audience loves. When a series like The Sopranos, for example, shows its characters toasting with whiskey in scenes loaded with tension, power, and vulnerability, the choice of bottle is not innocent. On the table of Tony Soprano and his circle, a Johnnie Walker can function as a code, a wink to the viewer who understands that this drink is associated with a certain idea of status, of a complex adult world, of decisions made in the half-light of an office where glass and alcohol coexist with secrets and threats. The brand enters that universe of fiction and comes out strengthened because it becomes associated with a powerful narrative, written with talent and acted with intensity. Over the years, the presence of Johnnie Walker in pop culture becomes more strategic and at the same time, more playful. The collaboration with Game of Thrones, for example, is a fascinating exercise in how a historic brand can converse with a modern franchise without losing its identity. The launch of White Walker, a special edition inspired by the icy specters of the series, uses wordplay intelligently, takes advantage of the enormous popularity of the world of Westeros, and at the same time reinforces the idea that whiskey is capable of blending into fantastic tales without ceasing to be what it is. The bottle, designed to reveal details when it is chilled, appeals to the fan who enjoys small surprises, the kind of person who lines up to see a premiere and who collects objects charged with emotional meaning. What is interesting is that this presence in cinema and series works in two directions. On the one hand, the brand benefits from the narrative strength of the stories in which it appears, It becomes associated with key moments, with scenes the audience remembers years later. On the other, creators use the bottle as a visual resource that quickly defines a character or a situation. Placing a Johnnie Walker on a table can suggest sophistication, decadence, celebration, or defeat, depending on how it is filmed, who holds it, and in what context it is served. It is a silent language that directors master and that the viewer interprets almost intuitively. As the 21st century advances, the dialogue with popular culture intensifies. The brand explores collaborations with musicians, urban artists, graphic designers, generating special editions that reinterpret the striding man, or play with the diagonal label to tell new stories. In some markets, bottles are released that incorporate references to specific cities, to cultural movements, to local figures who represent the idea of moving forward against difficulties. The bottle stops being an isolated object and becomes a canvas on which different generations of creatives project their vision of progress, rebellion, or personal reinvention. At the same time, the presence in music videos, on social networks, in photographs of celebrities, reinforces the feeling that Johnnie Walker is part of the everyday landscape of fame and success, even though success, in this era, no longer looks like it did at the beginning of the 20th century. Now triumph can be a streamer who has built an audience from the living room of their home, a technology entrepreneur who sells a startup for millions, an urban singer who fills stadiums. When some of them appear with a bottle in hand or with the logo in the background, the message sent to younger audiences is clear. This brand belongs to the world you move in. It speaks the same visual language as series, memes, and viral trends. However, the relationship with pop culture is not without risk. Being present in so many narratives means taking care not to fall into toxic associations, not to become trapped in characters that represent values contrary to what the brand wants to say about itself. In that sense, image management becomes a precise, almost surgical task, where it is evaluated which creative territories are worth entering, which franchises to align with, which collaborations reinforce the message of keep walking, and which could dilute it. The brand walks a fine line. It wants to be contemporary, but not lose its historical weight. It wants to speak to new generations, but maintain the respect of those who have accompanied it for decades. From an entrepreneurial perspective, what happens here is very revealing. A company that began in a shop in Kilmarnock ends up understanding that its brand is no longer measured only in cases sold, but in scenes remembered, in series dialogues, in film frames, in photographs that circulate on the internet. It has managed to become an element of the collective imagination, something people recognize without anyone needing to introduce it. And that state is one of the highest points any brand project can aspire to. Reaching it requires consistency, patience, and a deep understanding of how narratives are built in each era. In the end, the bottle that appears in Blade Runner, the drink poured in a scene of mobsters, the special edition that shines with a logo of ice dragons, are different manifestations of the same idea. Being present where people live intense and memorable emotions. And while the brand enjoys that almost mythical status on screen and in culture, the physical world where each of those bottles is made, stored, and shipped continues to face hard decisions, plant closures, relocations that hurt the communities where it all began, reminding us that behind the lights of Hollywood and television premieres, there are always factories, towns, and workers who are also part of the story. Painful closures, local rebellion, and reinvention. When in 2009 it was announced that Johnnie Walker's operations would leave Kilmarnock, the news fell on the city like a bucket of icy water thrown without anesthesia. because it was not just another industrial closure added to the long list of cuts brought on by the crisis, but a direct blow to an emotional bond woven over almost 2 centuries. A bond that had turned that small Scottish town into more than a point on the map, into the place where it all began. The cradle of a story that now seemed to be rewritten from offices very far removed from the Walker family's original shop, on the streets of Kilmarnock. The name Johnnie Walker was not simply a brand stamped on billboards or trucks. It was part of the people's emotional landscape. Many residents could point to a father, a grandfather, or an uncle who at some point had worked in the production plants or in bottling. So the announcement was not experienced merely as a business decision, but as a kind of sentimental rupture. A feeling of betrayal that was hard to digest when, for years, the striding man had been heard talking about walking toward the future, while the future, suddenly, seemed to be built elsewhere, leaving the original city watching from the roadside. The weeks following the announcement were marked by protests, demonstrations, banners hung from balconies, and fiery statements from local politicians and workers who watched direct and indirect employment linked to the brand slip through their fingers in exchange for an argument that sounded cold, almost surgical. Restructuring, efficiency, optimization of plants, concentration of production in other facilities considered more competitive within Diageo's global framework, a language that makes sense when looking at a spreadsheet. But that is very hard to accept when one has spent years placing hands on bottling lines and has felt part of something that went beyond a paycheck. In that clash between corporate logic and the wound of the community appears one of the great tensions of contemporary capitalism. The brand presents itself to the world wrapped in a narrative of roots, tradition, and Scottish pride. But the decisions that guarantee its financial continuity are made on a board where the exact location of chimneys matters less than the cost per liter produced. And that contrast, inevitable in a company of that scale, forces anyone who looks at the story honestly to accept that there are shadowed areas in all success stories. Moments in which moving forward implies leaving people behind, and in which the word progress takes on uncomfortable nuances. For Kilmarnock, the closure was not limited to an economic loss. It also meant the feeling that its role in the world had been cut back, that the born in 1820 proudly displayed in campaigns seemed all of a sudden to have changed its emotional address, taking with it a piece of local identity. Because for decades the town had functioned as a kind of physical anchor of the myth, the place one could point to when someone asked where the walk of the man with the top hat began. And now that anchor was being released, pushed by the unstoppable current of global decisions. The demolition of the facilities, which came a couple of years later, had something of a definitive, almost ritual gesture. As if by tearing down the warehouses and chimneys, a chapter were being closed in an irreversible way. The physical emptiness the factory left in the urban landscape became a metaphor for the symbolic emptiness many felt inside. And images of the walls falling circulated in newspapers and on television as a reminder that no brand story, however luminous it may be, is exempt from moments in which business and collective memory collide head-on. From Diageo's perspective, the decision was defended with arguments that any entrepreneur, however uncomfortable, can at least partly understand. Plants inherited from another era, costs difficult to justify compared to more modern facilities elsewhere. The need to ensure competitiveness in a market where margins tighten and pressure from shareholders and new consumers offers no respite. The company chose to concentrate production in more efficient centers, and from there supply a global market that continues to grow, even if the fuel for that growth is no longer generated in the same streets that saw the original project born. Faced with Kilmarnock's indignation and sadness, The company found itself facing a complicated challenge from a narrative point of view. How to continue speaking of roots and legacy when the main physical route has been pulled out? How to honor the community without reversing a strategic decision considered necessary? How to balance the coldness of numbers with some gesture that shows the brand does not forget where it comes from, even if it no longer manufactures there? The answer was not immediate, but over time it began to take shape at another point on the map, a few kilometers away, in a city with a different history and a different symbolic weight. Edinburgh, with its mix of history, tourism, and international appeal, became the stage for a new chapter. The opening of Johnnie Walker Prince's Street, a vast, experiential space installed in a former department store building converted into a whiskey temple, a place where the brand decided to condense its entire narrative into an immersive journey. Themed bars, tasting rooms, light and sound shows, and a rooftop bar with privileged views over the city. Here, it was no longer about producing, but about telling, about transforming history into experience, about turning everything you have heard so far into a journey that can be walked physically and emotionally. Inside that multi-story building, visitors move through rooms where screens, projections, and specialized guides explain how whiskey is blended, what role the distilleries of the coast, the highlands, and the islands play, how the Striding Man was born, and what keep walking means in a world that changes at a dizzying pace. Tastings are offered tailored to each person's palate. Basic tasting techniques are taught. People are allowed to play with aromas and flavors. And at the end of the route, a door opens onto a panoramic bar, where the square bottle becomes the center of a modern ritual. Photographs, toasts, stories shared on social media. This move toward the experiential temple responds to several logics at the same time. On the one hand, it takes advantage of the rise of whiskey tourism in Scotland, where millions of visitors a year seek to live something more than a technical visit to a distillery. They want to feel moved, to learn, to take a photograph with a glass in hand in front of a spectacular landscape. On the other, it allows the brand to concentrate its storytelling in a place that, although it is not Kilmarnock, is part of the most visible Scottish identity to the world, a city that is already on the list of dream destinations for half the planet. This bet on experience has a clear reading for anyone who undertakes a venture. In the contemporary economy, value is no longer generated solely in the factory. It is also built in the consumer's mind, in the spaces where they connect with the story of what they consume, in moments of immersion that reinforce the emotional bond with a brand. Johnnie Walker turns part of its legacy into spectacle, runs the risk of being accused of over-theatricalizing something that was born in the humility of a grocery shop, but at the same time succeeds in drawing in new generations who might never have set foot in an industrial plant, bringing them closer to the story with genuine curiosity. Of course, the wound of Kilmarnock is not healed by a premium experience in Edinburgh. Critical voices continue to exist that recall the closure every time the brand speaks of its roots, and that tension remains there, as a reminder that every decision has a cost somewhere. However, the company tries to keep memory alive through archives, tributes, and projects that recognize the importance of the origin, even if the physical center of gravity has shifted. In that uncomfortable duality between nostalgia and reinvention, much of the story of whiskey moves today. And understanding it requires accepting that the walk of the Striding Man does not always follow pleasant paths. While the lights of Prince's Street illuminate Edinburgh's nights and tourists from all over the world raise their glasses to the city's horizon, the brand begins to look toward another kind of demand of the 21st century. Concerns about sustainability, new sensitivities around responsible consumption, changes in generations who no longer relate to alcohol as their parents did. and that force a rethinking, once again, of what it means to move forward without losing one step. A future that keeps walking. When observing the recent trajectory of Johnnie Walker, it becomes evident that the brand has entered a stage in which past and future coexist in a constant creative tension. A kind of rope stretched between the tradition of Scotch whiskey and the cultural, technological, and environmental challenges of the 21st century. In this new scenario, the company is forced to rethink every part of its identity: how it produces, how it communicates, what it offers, whom it addresses, and what values it wants to represent in a world where consumption is scrutinized closely, where younger generations demand coherence and responsibility, and where sustainability has ceased to be a public relations gesture and has become a condition for survival. One of the most significant vectors of change appears in the need to transform the environmental footprint of production, because the global public, especially younger audiences, is not willing to support brands that ignore the climate crisis. In response, Johnnie Walker begins to review every link in its chain, from the use of renewable energy in distilleries to water management, a fundamental resource both for the production process and for the preservation of the Scottish ecosystems that give life to the malt whiskies used in the blends. The progressive reduction of carbon emissions becomes imperative. Energy efficiency policies are implemented in plants that no longer resemble the facilities of the past century, and research advances into lighter and more recyclable materials for bottles and packaging, without sacrificing the visual identity that characterizes the square bottle. In this search for balance between tradition and transformation, the brand launches initiatives such as bottles made with thinner glass, designed to reduce weight in transportation and therefore the environmental footprint associated with global distribution. It also experiments with packaging alternatives that eliminate unnecessary plastics, and pilots are proposed for bottles made partly from paper, a move that, although still in its early stages, suggests that the future of whiskey may not lie solely in improving what already exists, but in reinventing formats that for decades seemed untouchable. These projects, beyond their environmental impact, send a very powerful message. Even a historic brand must be willing to rethink itself from the ground up if it wants to keep walking in a world different from the one in which it was born. The other major axis of transformation is related to consumption and culture. Younger generations, especially those who have grown up in an environment where well-being and health occupy a central place, do not relate to alcohol in the same way their parents or grandparents did. Moderate, conscious, selective consumption has become the norm. Experience matters more than quantity, and quality weighs more than repetitive ritual. In this context, Johnnie Walker has begun to invest in products designed for situations where alcohol is not essential, with versions of its whiskeys in low alcohol or alcohol-free formats designed to preserve part of the aromatic profile and sensory structure of traditional whiskey, but adapted to moments when the consumer seeks to control intake or simply wants to participate in the social ritual without compromising other decisions. This type of product responds to a profound change in the way celebration is understood. It is no longer about drinking to reach a state, but about enjoying a moment, a conversation, a shared experience, without the need to overindulge. The challenge for a brand with a legacy so closely tied to traditional whiskey is enormous, because it must maintain the integrity of its history while exploring new territories, where production processes, aging, and the use of barrels no longer follow the same rules of the game. However, the move is inevitable if the brand wants to remain present in the hands of consumers who, out of personal conviction or cultural circumstances, seek more flexible options. Alongside this transformation of the product, Communication is also renewed. Keep Walking continues as a narrative beacon, but it is now interpreted from a broader and more contemporary angle. If in the 1990s the phrase accompanied stories of individual self-improvement, today it expands toward narratives about collective purpose, diversity, inclusion, and social reinvention. The brand tries to speak to a more complex world, where progress is no longer measured solely in personal achievements, but in the ability to contribute to fairer communities and a more livable planet. Recent advertisements show faces from different cultures, professions, and ages, reinforcing the idea that walking forward means recognizing multiple paths, not a single direction drawn from an office in London or New York. Digitalization also reshapes the bond with the consumer. Social media allows the brand to speak in real time, not from the solemn distance that characterized traditional whiskey advertising, but from a more direct and human tone. Collaborations emerge with artists, bartenders, chefs, and content creators who reinterpret the square bottle from unexpected perspectives, showing how whiskey can be integrated into contemporary gastronomy, creative cocktail making, or sensory experiences that challenge conventions. The striding man, far from remaining frozen as a historical symbol, becomes a flexible icon that adopts diverse graphic styles depending on the country, the campaign, or the occasion. Another key element of the brand's future lies in hospitality. Johnnie Walker. Prince's Street, that great narrative space in Edinburgh, functions as a laboratory for creating immersive experiences that can be replicated in other parts of the world. The idea is not only to sell whiskey, but to build a livable universe where people can interact with the history, the flavor, and the people behind each bottle. This experiential dimension is complemented by the growing presence of whiskey at gastronomic festivals, cultural events, and educational projects, where master blenders share their knowledge with audiences interested in understanding the art behind the blend. An art that, despite technological changes, continues to depend on human intuition, on the ear that listens to the wood, on the sense of smell that recognizes nuances impossible to fully describe. From an entrepreneurial perspective, the current stretch of Johnnie Walker's history shows that long-lived brands survive when they accept that success is not static. Tradition, to remain alive, requires constant updating, reinterpretation, courage to let go, and bravery to venture into the unknown. The company that was born from an orphaned boy who inherited a shop in Kilmarnock has had to rewrite itself many times. When facing changes in legislation, wars, corporate mergers, new technologies, economic crises, painful closures, and shifting social sensitivities. Each of these trials has been a reminder that progress is never guaranteed, that every step requires difficult decisions, and that sometimes advancement means leaving behind something dearly loved. In this sense, it is revealing to look at the entire story from this point. A boy blending barrels for his neighbors, a son who expanded the business across the seas of the empire, a character sketched on a napkin who taught the world to walk with style, a phrase that turned a gesture into a philosophy, a community that mourned a closure that still weighs on collective memory, and a present in which the brand tries to balance its legacy with new responsibilities, while preparing for a future where luxury will be sustainable or it will not be, and where bottles will have to tell stories capable of crossing screens, cultures, and generations. And so, while the golden glints of whiskey continue to reflect in thousands of glasses around the planet, the march goes on. Because, in its own way, every sip raised today carries the same promise that drove John Walker 2 centuries ago: to move forward with determination, to adapt without losing the soul, and to keep walking toward what comes next, even if the path changes, even if the world spins faster than ever. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most fascinating stories in the business world. If you have made it this far, tell me in the comments which part of this trajectory surprised you the most and which brand you would like us to explore next. I invite you to subscribe so you do not miss the upcoming documentaries on the channel. Good night.